Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you with us. We have over 300 people signed up for today's presentation. We're here with you live with a very excellent panel that we think will be really helpful for this timely topic on Regulation SP. My name is Salvatore Fay. I'm the President, Chief Executive Officer of Vigilant Compliance. We are here with an esteemed group of panelists. We have Matt Seidenberg. Matt is the CEO of Silver Pillar Advisors with over a decade of experience in compliance programs and cybersecurity, including developing, testing, and monitoring compliance programs for investment advisors, mutual funds, ETFs, and other parties. We also are welcoming Jessica Bird. Jessica is an attorney and partner at Stradley Ronan, and Jessica's practice is a very deep and excellent one. She has an investment management practice where she advises clients on regulatory compliance and governance, operational complexities, and her primary practice focuses on registered funds, independent investment advisors, fund directors, and other areas of compliance. We also are happy to have with us today Ezra Church, who's a partner at Morgan Lewis. He leads their privacy and cybersecurity litigation practice at Morgan. He counsels clients and represents them in the data privacy security area and the cyber area, including data breach, crisis management, and high-profile privacy and other class actions. Ezra has extensive experience in this area, and he's also, in addition to being an attorney, a certified information privacy professional. And so we're welcome all of you today. And I just want to mention in terms of housekeeping, the slides that we are using today are available online for you to print and to utilize. So we want to make it useful for everyone. And Jessica and Ezra and Matt have some additional information that we think you might find useful as you develop your programs. We're going to start by going through really what Regulation SP requires. So what's it require? And we're going to discuss how to build your compliance policies and procedures, common mistakes people make, and you want to avoid. And Matt from the cyber area is going to talk about what you can do to reduce the risk of cyber breaches. And then also Jessica and Ezra are going to go through, if you do have a breach, what should you do? What's your incident response plan look like? How you should react? What do you do in crisis management? And how you should prepare in advance, obviously, for these situations. Hopefully they don't occur, but we know no matter how strong your system is, you could be in a situation where your firm has a cyber breach. So with that, I'm going to go on to page 4, please, and talk about Regulation SP and the key sections of it. So first, before I get to Jessica and Ezra and Matt, just wanted to talk about firms must adopt written policies and procedures to protect customer records and information from anticipated threats and unauthorized access. Jessica, Matt, and Ezra are going to unpack that for us in a few minutes. So written procedures from anticipated threats and unauthorized access. So that's what we're trying to do. As I said, we're going to go into that in more detail. Also, there must be proper disposal of information. And when I first read this a few years ago, I thought, well, disposal, that's easy. Just get rid of documents when you should. But Ezra has some practical examples, and this ends up being extremely important in practical situations where there's data on different computers that probably never should be on that computer. So Ezra's going to cover that a little bit later. And then creation of privacy notices, which I think Jessica is going to talk about that in a few minutes. Turning to page 5, what the dates for the rules. So if you're a large firm over 1.5 billion, December 3rd, 2025 was your date. I think even those that have their policies in place, I think this will still be, we'll still have some very useful points in this seminar for you as you build out your program. And then June 3rd, 2026 for firms that are under 1.5 billion. I did want to mention that the SEC has been very, very active in the sweep area. We've had a number of clients, and I'm sure Jessica and Morgan Lewis has as well, that have gone through SEC exam sweeps, and they've been quite detailed in terms of the information that they're seeking. So we're going to have the panelists talk about that in a few minutes. So why don't we start with the incident response plan? So you need an incident response plan to address any breaches any unauthorized access, and the use of customer information. So maybe I'll turn it first, Jessica, to you. Jessica, when you're building an incident response plan, what are you looking for clients to have in that plan? Who's usually in the room when you're meeting them? What types of professionals? And what's the key points that you're counseling your clients on?
So what you are looking for in the plan is basically going to be a step-by-step list of what needs to happen when a breach of customer information occurs. So it's going to be important to have people in the room who might not really be involved with other compliance issues for registered investment advisors and broker-dealers. It will be really important to have your cybersecurity, your IT people in the room, people who are familiar with where customer information is stored and how it is accessed and who may access it. And you're going to want to go through and kind of step-by-step figure out, like I said, where it's located and what your actions are going to be if there is a breach. Another very important thing that you want to have right from the get-go is a person or persons who are going to own this process, because you can have policies and procedures, it's great, but if there's nobody there overseeing and making sure that they actually get implemented, then you're not going to look very good if the SEC comes to examine you.
Great. And I've seen, Jessica and Ezra and Matt, I've seen situations with leading firms where they'll sort of have levels of breaches or potential breaches, and then there may be different people that are on the panels. Ezra, do you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of what you're seeing and some practical advice? If you're a chief compliance officer and your CEO says, hey, I want you to build me an incident response plan, and I'm sure they're doing that, but what should they be thinking about? Should they, in terms of levels, in terms of who's on the different panels? Maybe you give us some practical examples from your practice.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the level question, typically there's a lot of security incidents that may happen from a day-to-day basis, and not all of them are going to rise to the level of an incident under Reg S-P. I think the key factors are the moment you have an indication that customer or consumer information is impacted, that should be something that's going to hit the incident response plan and get everyone's attention. Any shutdown of a significant system, so a shutdown of a platform that's going to really hurt the firm's operations would be another trigger. I would say a ransom demand, which unfortunately we see a lot of ransomware attacks. There's been a huge epidemic of ransomware attacks over the last several years. A ransom attack would be, I think, the third trigger that I would think of in terms of really kicking off a robust incident response process.
Thank you, Ezra. Ezra, and we started out by talking about what's required, and so you need written policies and procedures for anticipated threats and unauthorized access. Just from your practice, could you help the people who are board members here, or people overseeing investment advisors, what type of anticipated threats should they be thinking of? They certainly should get input from their, and Matt's going to get a little input from the cyber side, but what type of threat should they be thinking about in terms of what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different anticipated threats we're continuing to see. A lot of it is kind of an evolution of what we've seen over the past few years, which is a lot of social engineering type attacks, whether it's phishing, whether it's someone calling, pretending to be the help desk, trying to get access to your system. A lot of deepfake. Unfortunately, I had an incident just a couple of weeks ago where chief accounting officer sitting in his office gets a DocuSign email with an NDA. It says, hey, give me a call. And the DocuSign purported to be from a major law firm partner in London, a firm with which the client does a lot of work. He gives them a call. The supposed CEO gets on the phone, and this is someone the chief accounting officer knows, works with on a regular basis. And the chief accounting, the CEO, supposedly the CEO, says, hey, I need you to wire $5 million to an account at the Bank of China. Of course, he says, yes, CEO, I'll do that. The money goes out the door. And of course, it was a deep fake. And this is amazing because this chief accounting officer, he sees the CEO every day. He knows the way the CEO talks, mannerisms, and so forth. So the deepfake issue, I think, is really going to be, we're starting to see that as a big challenge. And I think that's going to be a huge issue over the next few years, kind of an evolution of the phishing and the social engineering to true deception
Right.
on the part of the attackers.
Right, and we've seen some advisors tricked in similar ways. I think you should be particularly sensitive if people are on vacation, especially key people that are on vacation. Like Jessica, you shaking your head, you had some of these situations. CFOs on vacation, or a CFO leaves the firm and they're contacting another person, and they're also often putting a call me back at this number or an email address. And Matt will get into some of the spoofing emails in a minute. But when you should maintain a list, and Ezra, I think you recommended this to your clients, maintain a list of trusted numbers. It's something, Ezra, is that something you're recommending, that you have a list that's already baked in, a hard list, so that if the bad guy calls you and says, yeah, call me at this number, what are you saying, and what do you recommend to clients there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a matter of training. Employees have to know that if they get an email or a phone call asking for a call to a particular number, that they should not be calling that number. They should verify separately. An email purporting to be from the CEO. Well, go to your Rolodex and call the number you have for the CEO or whoever it may be, the board member, and call them that way to verify. That's huge, I think.
Thank you, Ezra. Matt, that's a good segue to you. Matt, when you're training people, I think training is key, and we recommend really training like 2 times a year, because as Ezra mentioned, we do see situations where bad guys are getting smarter, they're trying different tricks, and we want to be as smart. What are you seeing, Matt, in terms of what are you recommending to people in terms of their training, in terms of their looking at email addresses that seem suspicious, and so on?
Yeah, so for training, it's not something that you don't want to do once a year. It needs to be conducted on a regular basis. For example, phishing simulations, I would say like every other week or at least once a month. Security awareness trainings, ideally it would be good to conduct those once a month to cover various topics such as ransomware, password security, social engineering. Also, it's important to conduct tabletop exercises. It's critical for preparing, improving responses. It helps organizations identify where their flaws are, and it can also expose paper readiness versus real readiness. You can have all the plans, but if you're not exercising them, they can review those plans there's some flaws in those plans.
Mm-hmm. Matt, what are you doing in terms of in terms of spoofing? We've seen clients unfortunately have situations where they maybe an investment advisor. I think Jessica, you may have seen some of these situations as well. You have an investment advisor, they're getting investment research from particular sources. Investment research company was hacked. They send an email, somebody clicks onto it. It was slightly different. Is it too much to expect the employee clicked on the phishing, so that opened the door? But is it too much to expect humans to be able to see these pieces? What can be done as a practical matter that we can educate the staff so they're not clicking into something that looks like someone, as Ezra said, that they've dealt with in the past?
Yeah, so that's where those test simulation emails come into effect. So you can kind of see where your weak links are, and if someone fails a simulation email, you can kind of talk to them, review like, hey, you notice that this email was very urgent, there was incorrect spelling, the font was off. So it's kind of a learning experience. And also, if you're not sure, just report it to IT. Most emails you can report a phish email, which will send it to your IT department and they can review it and verify. Or you can, like what was mentioned earlier, go to the source. Like, hey, John, did you send this email to me requesting this? And you can kind of verify it that way.
Right. Matt, maybe just talk about that a little bit, sending it to your IT group and they can open the email safely. You get on the phone, maybe just go through technically what people the practical steps, how that works.
Yeah, so if you're sitting there, an email comes through, you have to log into an email comes through that requests you to log into your Microsoft account or Google account. If you're not sure, you typically press the report a phish button to IT. They'll call you, say, hey, Matt, this is a legitimate email. You can proceed. If not, just delete the email.
That's essentially a way to quarantine to open it at the IT group, open it in a safe environment.
Yes, safe
So you're not
environment.
affecting
And
your
then one
system.
important thing is, I do see it sometimes, do not forward a potential phishing email to a coworker. Like, hey, was this you? Because that just opens the gates to other people being affected. So that's an important thing, to not forward these potential phishing emails.
Good, thank you. Thank you. I did want to mention that that those listening in can type in questions in the chat box, and we will get to those questions. If we don't get to them today, we'll also direct them to Jessica, to Matt, or to Ezra, and hopefully they can get back to you directly with if you have a particular question you want to share openly. We can also forward that on and get it to the right person. So in terms of protocols, we see, as you mentioned, different protocols for different incidences. You're seeing the details there. And are you seeing a lot of firms, have different escalation processes depending on the type of incident? In other words, there's a ransomware that's really bad. Phishing, you get them every day. What are clients doing in terms of drafting those policies?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 or 3 steps of escalation. The first is just when you're triggering the actual incident response process, and kicking off the team, organization, so forth. And then often there's kind of a higher level escalation where you're really going to the top. You're alerting the board or whoever about a really serious issue, and that's where you've got clear potential access to a number of customer records, significant shutdown issue, or ransom. I think those are the escalations. The one thing I guess I would say on incident response plan is sometimes more is not better. It can be the 2 key things in my view are, number one, you got to identify the team and make sure you know who, both internally and externally, so external counsel and external forensics and so forth, you want to bring into the discussion, into the war room, if you will. So identify the team, and then think about what are the key questions. What's the checklist that we want to make sure we follow when we do have an incident? A lot of times I see incident response plans and they try to anticipate every possible, it's like a playbook, and they're trying to anticipate every possible situation. And first of all, you can't do that because they're always unique, and there's always things that you can't necessarily anticipate. And secondly, in a crisis moment, that's just not going to be that valuable. You really need something that's pretty tight, and that you can look at in just a few pages. I think this is good news, frankly, for our clients, because they don't need to feel overwhelmed. I mean, the key really, again, is to identify your team and to think about what's the key questions. Have a couple pages of like the key questions, identify the key systems and data, as has been mentioned, and you really and then practice. Be an active team, as Matt referred to. Those are really the key steps from my perspective.
Thank you, Ezra. Jessica, are you seeing, in terms of detail for the group, are you seeing people have lots of detail? Are you seeing the checklist? Do you like the checklist, when you're counseling your clients?
It really depends on the client and the size of the client, but I'm agreeing with Ezra, having a checklist is handy, but at the same time, when you're thinking about, I'm thinking about this from an SEC exam perspective, one of the most important things is to not put something in your policy or procedure that you're not going to be able to show that you do or are able to do. And that's where a lot of firms get in trouble, particularly with Reg S-P, of just kind of taking like a boilerplate to-do list and dropping it in. And that's because compared to a lot of other policies and procedures that are required under SEC regulations, this one is so very specific to the individual investment advisor, broker dealer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Why don't we go on to talk about notification? So, Matt's gonna talk about some more things later, so you don't have a breach, hopefully, but suppose there is a breach, and in terms of who we have to alert, Jessica, and if we could turn to page 7, for the folks in the webinar. Want to talk a little bit about the type of information, and who has to be alerted and the time period.
Sure. So if there is found to be a access to unauthorized information, the customers have to be notified. And these are people who have what is referred to as a customer relationship with the firm. They will need to receive a breach notification that includes what happened, what information was involved, what the firm is currently doing to fix that, and what the customer themselves should do to keep their self safe, and finally, who to contact. Something that's really interesting about this is that customers are really the only party that needs to be notified. There is no need to notify any regulators, at least at this first stage when you're still sort of figuring out the extent of the breach.
Okay, thank you. And so, and that's it, Jessica, that's within, as soon as practical or within 30 days.
Exactly.
Right?
Thank you. Yes, that is absolutely within 30 days. And that's to be contrasted with the notification requirement for service providers, which I know we're definitely going to get to,
Yes.
which has to be within 72 hours of when the incident occurred. And that would be the service provider needs to notify the covered institution.
Right. And Jessica, you mentioned that they have to tell about the incident, the data breach, and I'm sure, you know, you're working with clients that's got to be a pretty careful drafting exercise, so not to alert them, but making sure you're doing the right disclosure.
Absolutely. It's kind of a fine line. I mean, you want to be as helpful to the customer, but also, you know, sometimes, you know, too much information is less helpful than very basic information. I think the most important really is directing the customers to how they can protect themselves and who they should contact to help that, whether it be, you know, some kind of, you know, agency that helps, you know, there's a lot of firms out there that will help you if there's been a breach to kind of like do monitoring going forward of any of your information getting out there.
Yeah, and that's really a good point, because I think, you know, the people around this table and others, you know, that your firm's relying on, your firm will have, you know, your legal firm or your compliance firm will have good people that they utilize before who would come in quickly. So that's very good to point out. Ezra, there's some times where obviously the firm is not required to report, so I have to imagine that that requires some, you know, sensitive thinking. You know, certainly if you're required to report, you're going to report, but you don't want to go out to clients and alarm them, as Jessica's saying. So how do you think through that process? What should, you know, you're trying to figure out whether there's been unauthorized access. Maybe information went to another firm. We see this often happen, you know, a service provider, a fund accounting agent sends certain information to a firm, but that firm is another investment firm that has a code of ethics in place. You don't really think it's going to be utilized. Take us through some of the analyses that you use to think about that.
Yeah, so I think you know, the rule is flexible, and it recognizes the fact that when you have a security incident, it often takes some time to figure out what really happened. And that's why they give you the 30 days. And the notice really triggers from the 30 days when you become aware of the unauthorized access of the sensitive customer information. So what we typically are doing is, number one, we're trying to make sure we do a thorough investigation and figure out what exactly happened. Was there actually unauthorized access to customer information? And then once we have that report done, then we're sitting down and saying, all right, based on what we know, do we have an obligation? The other thing so your example about, you know, maybe the information was actually disclosed to a trusted party. And I think the rule kind of builds that potential analysis in as well, because if you look at the definition of sensitive customer information, there's a analysis you can do in terms of the risk and whether there's actually a risk of harm. And so, you know, this is a very common scenario where a client calls me up and says, hey, information has been sent to the wrong email, right?
Mm-hmm.
List of investor information sent to the wrong email. And very typically, very often, if you can get the other side to confirm, hey, we got the email, we deleted it, we didn't look at it, it hasn't been printed out, it hasn't been disseminated. And in fact, we'll sign a declaration to that effect, or we'll put that in writing. Then you put that in the file and you feel like, you know what, there's really no risk of harm. There's no reason to go out and tell customers about this issue, because it's just going to create unnecessary, make them unnecessarily upset. And so that is a conclusion you can reach. Of course, you really have to bring all the facts to the table before you're able to kind of reach those conclusions.
And you've probably seen as well situations where there's sort of false flags in the sense that somebody sends an email to CEO, says, hey, we have your information, but there's no evidence they actually have their information. They're just bluffing. So when you're thinking about it and you're thinking about the days, I would think you want to err on the side of doing enough research and taking enough time before you go out to the clients if there's not really a breach. How do you think that through? Do you tell clients, hey, let's somebody makes a statement, let's see what happens. Let's have our IT group see if they're seeing any holes. What do you do there?
Absolutely. I think this is probably the biggest challenge that I see often when I get the call on the Friday or the holiday weekend with the big. It's always then,
Right.
which is fine. But often often the instinct is to communicate, which I understand, right? These organizations, they want to be truthful, they want to be transparent, but often that can be really harmful. It takes some time to figure out what happened. And the last thing you want to do is communicate out and then realize that the story has changed, or that it isn't as serious or more serious than it was. And so I think the rules, again, they're helpful in that they give you the time to do that investigation, figure out what happened, and then make a decision about how you want to provide notice.
So probably don't want to oversimplify, but as a rule of thumb, you want to make sure you have all the information, because once you go out to the customer, you can't retract that. That's
Absolutely.
You're not going to go in 6 months, but with if you need a couple extra days to determine, you're determining that.
Yeah.
Okay. Matt, it's probably a good point to mention now vulnerability and penetration testing for advisors and funds, et cetera. What are you recommending, in terms of the vulnerability and penetration testing annually, weekly, daily? Can't do it all the time because the IT persons are, actually running the business here. Maybe just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I think I recommend at least once a year, and for vulnerability testing, you can also incorporate quarterly vulnerability scans, because as everyone knows, as every day goes by, more and more threats become available. If bad actors, they'll find another way to get in your door. So if you kind of stay on top of where our open doors are, you can start fixing those, and not once a year you get a big list of open doors, and it takes a long time to get those doors closed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then just for the folks that are not doing that every day, just mention like the details of what's different about a vulnerability test and a penetration test.
So vulnerability is kind of, you're looking outside of a company versus a penetration testing. You're pretty much giving them the keys to your house, and you're just letting them go through your house to see what they can open and what they can get into and how deep they can get into. So penetration is like more in depth.
So in terms of giving someone the keys to look in, you want to be careful in terms of who you're hiring, obviously.
Exactly. So that's why you want to make sure you conduct thorough background checks. Make sure they only have access to the files that they're the clients that they're working on, nothing more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's good to have periodic reviews for access.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Matt. Jessica and Matt, I want to come back to you in a second on this one as well. Jessica, in terms of monitoring service providers, okay, the Reg S-P says you must develop written policies and procedures related to the oversight and monitoring of service providers. And I'm going to ask Matt about the details, but those service providers, and this is on page 8 for those following along with the webinar, service providers are required to provide notice to the firm, to your client, Jessica, say, for example, Alpha Investment Advisors, within 72 hours of the service provider becoming aware of an incident. So we all know that these large firms and even medium or small quote $1 billion investment firms, they have a lot of service providers. They have people doing their IT, they have people doing accounting, they have people doing QuickBooks, they have people doing research. So we kind of seen at Vigilant sort of three ways, and I wanted to get your thoughts and comments on it. Some people are going out saying, hey, here's a new contract, sign this contract that says 72 hours. Some are doing addendums. Others are doing a negative consent saying, hey, we expect you to do this notice. One, what are you recommending to clients? And it's probably different depending on the type of clients and data. And how are the different levels, if you think of it, relevant to the people who are sitting in your client's chair?
Sure, that's a really good question. The service provider oversight was probably one of the biggest changes and one of probably the most controversial portions of the final rule. And what you just mentioned, writing a new contract or perhaps having a contract addendum is probably the best and the highest level of confidence that you could get from a service provider that they're going to provide you with the notice. But unfortunately, we have seen, and even the SEC actually even anticipated that might not always be available, particularly when you're looking at, web service providers like Amazon or, I'm trying to think of other, there's a lot of them out there that basically will look at you and say, we're not going to do that. So you mentioned negative consent. What that means is you basically go to all of your service providers and you put in an email, you understand that we are now subject to the requirements of Regulation S-P. You as a service provider agree to provide us notice within 72 hours if there's a breach of customer information. And unless you say by X date that you will not do this, we're going to assume you're in compliance. We've gotten pushback from that as well. We've also had clients going out trying to get more just sort of like a general affirmation and attestation that they understand the requirements of the rule and that they're going to give the 72-hour notice. We've also had clients that are, customer service providers that are not willing to do even that. So when you are getting to this stage, when you're kind of getting pushback from all angles, one of the most important things that you need to do is document. You show exactly what it is that you did, the outreach that you performed, what came back from the customer service provider, and just have that in your records available. I think we're still in early time, so I don't know that the pushback is necessarily going to continue now that, it hasn't even yet been a full year yet. So this is something I'm seeing, and it's something definitely to keep in mind.
And Jessica, that's very helpful. We do have a question that, how far back do you go? How deep do you go in terms of figuring out if somebody is a service provider? Are you seeing that come up, or clients having questions? Well, do I have to go to, the people who rent the office and see if, they have controls in the weekends? What are you kind of practical questions are you getting?
Yeah, so the definition of a service provider includes the phrase provide services directly. So the way that we're looking at it is kind of like that top level provider, the one who does your billing, the one who does your cybersecurity, and not necessarily going out to that second level. We haven't really gotten much feedback yet on exam results of how the SEC is looking at that. But as of right now, I think the direct service provider is kind of what the lens that we're focusing on.
And Matt, in terms of what you do at Silver Pillar to review the service providers for your investment advisor clients, talk about whether that's a good idea, whether the advisor should do it themselves, whether they should utilize a firm, the benefits and drawbacks of that.
Yeah, no, I think they should use a outside company. When dealing with vendors or service providers, you want to make sure they have a mature security program. You want to make sure they have the proper security policies, like written information security policies. Make sure they have the proper access controls in place, like least privilege, multi-factor authentication. You can also request their SOC 2 Type 2 reports. And a good question to find out is determine what data do they collect, where do they store it, process it, and transmit it. And also, how long do they keep the data for? If you fire the service provider, or if they go away, do they destroy it? Do they hand it back to you? And also, it's good to see, who their subcontractors are.
So Matt, you have clients or investment advisors using Silver Pillar to ask the right questions.
Yes.
And say, hey, because the advisor might not necessarily know what they ask.
Yes.
One thing you mentioned is least privilege, and I'm going to ask Ezra to talk about that a little bit and just unpack that a little bit for the group. And I think, Ezra, it goes into what we're going to talk about next, disposal, because I know you mentioned as we were preparing for the seminar, lots of situations where there was data on laptops for particular people that was compromised. And when we went back, thought, well, why is that data even there? And it tied into disposal. Maybe start with least privilege, and then let's dive a little bit into what we see on page 9, safeguard disposal.
Yeah. So in terms of least privilege, that just means that people are only getting access to the systems and information that they need to complete to do their job. And sometimes you can do that on a role basis. So, investment advisors, they need access to certain systems. They may not need access to what HR folks need access to or what others need access to. But really, really important to have to be monitoring the level of access that your folks have. I think the challenges that we see in that area are a couple, maybe 4 challenges. The one is permission creep. So over the time, people have been around for a while. They just naturally start to get access to more and more within your firm. And that needs to be something that's really reviewed on a regular basis. The second is departing employees. And I've had multiple significant data breaches involving departing employees where, the access was supposed to be turned off immediately, but there was a little bit of lag. Sometimes there's a little bit of technical lag. And in the meantime, the employees at home downloading, tons of investor information. So that's a problem. I think the third would be over provisioning of vendors. Often, you get a new vendor, you have a level of trust. You've done the diligence that Matt talked about, and they can get maybe a lot more access than they need, which can create problems down the road. And then the fourth is what I've already mentioned, which is the regular review. You've got to be looking at this issue on a regular basis, make sure everyone really only has the level of access that they need.
I think that's really important. So as part of that disposal, kind of as Matt covered, disposal is one piece, and then also your sort of ongoing review, maybe annual review. Do you see people doing, what do you recommend? Should they do it annually? Should they do it by department thing? Like a department gets together and says, okay, look, who has this employee data? We know investment advisors are holding clients' money and they have their account numbers and so on. So, what do you what's some of the practical practices that our folks can take away here?
Yeah, I would probably defer to Matt on the time frame. I think at least annually makes a lot of sense. The point about the disposal rule that I wanted to raise, I think this often gets kind of set aside because people think, oh yeah, if I'm going to destroy information, if I'm going to dispose of information, I'm going to do it in a reasonable way. But this is actually really, really important when you think about your overall risk. And this is the point that you were talking about, Salvatore, with respect to information that just tends to sit around. There's this inertia that we often see with firms where they just keep data forever. Mm-hmm. And all you're doing is, maybe some of that, good reason for that. Some of that needs to be kept for regulatory reasons. And, Jessica would tell us what those rules are and so forth. But a lot of times you have data that's kept that just does not need to be on your systems. It doesn't need to be on company laptops, or maybe you have a system that actually you're not using anymore. It's just sitting out there. Mm-hmm. Huge risk there as well. So having a regular process, probably is annual, maybe every other year, of really taking a hard look at what data we have sitting on our systems that we just don't need to have anymore, mm-hmm. will reduce your risk. I can't tell you how many data breaches we've had where we find we end up doing an investigation. We say, oh, there's all this information that now we have to notify, and everyone's sitting around saying, why do we have this information? There's no reason for us to continue to have it. We were only creating this risk that we didn't even realize we had. So working with a firm like Silver Pillar to help come up with a regular way that you're analyzing, what data you're keeping. Are you properly sunsetting permissions and systems, I think that could be really, really valuable to reducing long-term risk
Right.
for firms.
I think they're all great points, Ezra. Thank you. Ezra and Jessica, we did have a question. It's probably relates a couple slides back, which is 7, which is notification. So we know that some states like New York kind of define, what is that sensitive data that has to be, and it gives some examples of that sensitive data. So I'm sure that the states vary, but maybe for the folks that are listening, what are some of the examples of sensitive data? If you want to start, Ezra, and then Jessica come behind them there. Like, in other words, obviously driver's license numbers, social security numbers.
Sure.
How are states defining it, and what should, have a breach, obviously you're looking at the particular state laws, maybe just mention that.
Yeah, so I think the key here for people to understand is you have Reg S-P, which now has a notification requirement for sensitive customer information. But there's also 50 states that have their own breach notification laws that are going to apply. And the states vary in how they interact with Reg S-P. So some of the states will say, as long as you're complying with Reg S-P with respect to sensitive customer information, then you don't have to do anything under our state law. Other states will say, as long as you're notifying the customers under Reg S-P, then just let us know, the state attorney general, and that's fine. Some states, I was looking at New York. So New York says, yeah, go ahead and notify the individuals under Reg S-P. If there's more than 500 who are residents of New York, then you also have to let the AG know this as well. So that's the challenge. In terms of the types of data, the states actually are pretty, this is actually one of the helpful things about them, and they're pretty defined. Typically, it's a name plus a sensitive identifier. Okay. And this is pretty, I mean, it varies a little bit, but pretty much you're looking for a name plus a social, driver's license, passport, financial account information, health information. Those are what's going to trigger notice under the state laws. The other, I guess the last point I want to make is you may have a breach where you have sensitive customer information where you have to provide Reg S-P notice. That same breach may have other information, including employee information, not covered by Reg S-P because it's employees, it's not customer information, but you may then have a full-on breach notification obligation under, many or all 50 states.
So Jessica, as you counsel your people, are you looking at the key states that they're operating in, or you're looking at in advance, or you're looking at after the fact?
Well, it kind of side by side, I mean, really, for my practice, and I practice under the federal securities laws, our main focus is Reg S-P under the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. But, we definitely take into account where our investment advisors, broker-dealers operate, where they have customers, and Ezra, you did a very good job just kind of explaining, you may have these other requirements. So you definitely, you can't just forget that there's a state requirements.
And that's a great point, Jessica. So page 10, we talk about Graham-Leach-Bliley there, so maybe it's good to go there. Jessica, you maybe want to talk about, covered institutions under the rules, so who that covers and who's included. Fairly all your clients that you listed there.
So covered institutions off the top of my head are registered investment advisors, broker-dealers, transfer agents, and particularly one word platforms. I forget what the exact wording was in the adopting release, but it's a pretty wide range and investment companies.
So right. So basically, if you're sitting there and you're in the investment business, your clients are likely to have the requirement. At 11, we have some information. I don't know, Jessica, if there's anything you want to call out there, in terms of the delivery of the privacy notice. There's some exceptions to delivery. Anything for the group that you want to call out on page 11 there?
Yeah, sure. So just really quickly, privacy policy notice. Now, this is distinct from the notification that we've been talking about, which was customer breach notification. The privacy policy notice has actually been with Reg S-P since its inception, and it is required to be given to customers at the initiation of a customer relationship, and then annually, assuming that there have been no changes to the privacy policy. And one of the exceptions is if you share customer information with other entities, if you only share that information for purposes of, servicing your clients, for processing, for legal compliance. That would be another reason you don't have to do the annual update. But it's another notification that's very important that sometimes gets lost, and it's another one to keep in mind with Reg S-P.
Good, thank you, Jessica. We have a question relating to dual contract, Jessica. So we had a client that had a sweep exam. They're asking, a client has a sweep exam, they have a dual contract. For example, they're providing a model portfolio to Merrill Lynch. And the SEC in their sweep exam said, or Merrill Lynch, or any other providers. So if you're in that situation, the SEC said, well, Merrill Lynch is sending them their privacy notice, but they were taking the position, at least this staff member, that you also had to provide the underlying, I'll call sub-advisor's privacy notice. And it makes it a little difficult because Merrill's not going to share their email addresses of their clients with you, but they're saying, hey, you have to do a mailing. So are you generally recommending that you have a investment advisor that's also, providing, have a dual contract with another party or sub-advisor to provide your privacy notice as well?
I mean, yeah, if the farthest outreach that you can do would probably be the best, especially if you've got the SEC coming in that situation.
Right.
And telling you need to do this.
And I think you alluded to this earlier, in terms of being prepared to document what you sent, and when you sent it, the list of whom you sent it, et cetera. I think you mentioned that earlier as well. That's a good idea. Okay, very good. Thank you. Matt, we kind of alluded to what's on page 13 a little bit, third-party oversight, sample language, prior to engaging the service provider, et cetera, annual testing and review, at least of your policies and procedures. Anything else you wanted to reference that, you might want to include that's listed on page 13 or otherwise?
Yeah, so in terms of reviewing service providers or vendors, it should be reviewed at least annually. But if an event occurs at the vendor, such as a cybersecurity breach, there's a change of scope, then another assessment should be conducted. It's also a good idea to keep a written vendor inventory listing of each provider.
That's a very good point.
Type out the NPI access and the oversight activities performed. And, when you're dealing with a vendor, make sure they have the proper policies and procedures in place, how long they keep the data, and, whether they use subcontractors, if the subcontractors are vetted, find out whether the vendor remains liable for a subcontractor failure.
Yeah, and I think, Matt, it's a really good practical point. Vigilant likes to see if you have a vendor listing and you have the parties, and I think, Jessica, you alluded to this earlier, if you have people sitting down in the room saying, who's our vendors? Because everybody, I think as I pointed this out a little bit, everybody, you're in different silos. HR has vendors, and, investment advisors, they have, research people that are vendors. So I think that's a great point to sit down, do a vendor listing, and also could show that SEC, good practical point you're thinking of it as well. Excellent. Turning to page 14 for a minute, we covered some of this already in other parts, but in terms of your policy, you should designate a person responsible for the information security program. Jessica mentioned, and as you're documenting, senior management to approve, identifying all systems that touch NPI, or at least, trying to identify those key systems. And if you get the right people in the room, you could sort of brainstorm, and, you say something and somebody says, oh, what about these other people? They have information, evaluating privacy notices, which Jessica mentioned, confirming disposal rules, which I think Ezra, you covered in good detail already. Maintaining logs of access and NPI, and due diligence from that, which you referenced. So you have one page 14 to kind of list all those things, but I think we've talked about those in detail. Jessica, anything else you wanted to add related to those points?
I think I would just add that, especially for smaller advisors, I work with a lot of chief compliance officers, and I think this is really the first time that a lot of them have had to really dig deep into cybersecurity and IT. There was a proposed cybersecurity rule and in fact, a proposed service provider rule at the SEC in the last administration, both of which were abandoned. So when I look at the Reg S-P requirements, I can kind of see that the SEC had an overarching plan to kind of incorporate all of these aspects. And since we're kind of just left with this Reg SP, it could kind of seem a little sort of outside of a chief compliance officer's wheelhouse. So I think, as you mentioned, one of the most important things to do is to really get with your cybersecurity, your IT people, and figure out the mechanics of how this information is stored and how it travels. Because it's not until you actually understand this is that you're going to be able to write policies and procedures for your own individual information.
And I would just add to that, I mean, it's not just a compliance issue, it's a practical issue because in the moment when you're getting a ransom demand from a Russian hacker or somebody sent, $5 million at the door, you don't want to be scrambling to figure out where the data is and what the systems are and what the vendors are and what the terms are.
Right.
Having that done in advance is going to be so valuable when the crisis hits.
So I think that's a great point for a number of reasons, because the chief compliance officer is not the chief investment officer. They're not the chief technology officer. They're not the chief vendor supervisor, but you kind of have to be the catalyst to make sure you're getting the policy written, getting the right people in the room. So I think that's extreme, and asking the right question, asking the hard question. But what if this happens? Then what will we do? Or how are we going to handle that? So I think the chief compliance officer has a key role there. I think that's a good point. Jessica, we've covered this already, but on 15, we kind of have like what to do now. So identify a gap assessment to identify where policies and procedures are. You and Ezra talked about that already. Draft or update your policies on written security incident response and vendor oversight. Matt, you talked about that. Execute or update the vendor agreement. Jessica, you talked about that. And then obviously full compliance is required, but it's a new rule, and we're still, I think everybody out there is one of the reasons for the seminar is still learning this. Jessica, anything else you want to point out? Like, say you have your incident response plan, you're doing the things some really good practical points that were recommended here. Should they, in 12 months, kind of meet and say, hey, where do we stand? What are we doing? How's this working? What's the new policies? What's the new data we have?
I think before you need to come into compliance, which I know there are a lot of smaller firms listening to this, before June 3rd, you should sit down and have a mock test, go through what all the parties would be doing, go through the policies and procedures and making sure that nothing is left out. As you know, the SEC was really quick to jump on the large institutions when December 3rd came. So the SEC is not going to be expecting, people to sort of just wake up on June 3rd and to start the process. They're going to be expecting that you're going to be able to show documented evidence that your policy is up and running and ready to go.
So mock test, Jessica, and to Ezra's point, that checklist, putting together a checklist could really help the CCO in that piece. 16, we talked a little bit about preventing a breach. Matt, can we turn it over to you to some of the things, encryption, dual factor authentication, phishing, some of this we talked already, restricting physical access, badge access, employees leaving. And we have lots of great points listed on page 16. Matt, anything you want to call out, or some of those for the folks listening and maybe Ezra as well?
Yeah, so we did talk about multi-factor authentication. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency states that by using MFA on your accounts, it makes you 99% less likely to be hacked. It's one of the simplest and most effective way to prevent unauthorized access. So it should be required for all employees across all platforms when you're able to, especially for emails, VPNs, remote access. And I do tell people that if it gives you the ability to use multi-factor authentication, you should use it. Another point about multi-factor authentication is I recommend using stronger forms of it, such as authenticator apps or tokens. rather than text messages, because, there's a potential due to SIM swapping or even phishing text messages. So it's better for stronger authenticator apps.
Very good. Is there anything else you want to call out there?
I mean,
folks?
I think this is a great list. I was looking today at every year there's a study that IBM does on data breaches and the cost of data breaches. And the one thing that always strikes me is, so they do this calculation where they say, well, what are the things that an organization can do to reduce the cost of a breach? Average cost of a breach, by the way, in the United States, $6 million. So that's average. So some are a lot higher, some are lower.
Sure.
But they do this calculation. Well, what are the things that a firm can do to reduce the costs? And every year it's actually things that are not that sophisticated. So employee training will reduce your cost of a breach by $250,000. Incident response planning reduce your cost of a breach by $248,000, and then having an incident response team $225,000. So I guess I say that as it's kind of encouraging. Certainly all of the security things are critical, and everything that Matt's covered is so important. But part of it is just getting organized, thinking sweating this a little bit in advance can make such a difference in a moment.
I think that's a really good point. And in terms of the why, as you talked about the cost, but also if you're an investment advisor and your client's data is stolen, and somebody's sitting there, Mr. and Mrs. Jones are sitting there and saying, hey, I have my money with this person. The money may not stay there. I'm Jessica shaking her head. You really gotta think about it. We've seen the money go out from advisors, and then they're in a very difficult situation. Ezra, we do have a question on insurance, and whether people are getting insurance and seeing insurance, and is the insurance, if you took the time to parse the policy, really good. I'll have a comment and I'll turn it over to you, Ezra. We're seeing clients more clients are getting insurance because the price has come down from posts like 4 or 5 years ago. But Ezra, on these situations that you're involved in, are you seeing, do clients have insurance, and is the insurance really, as a practical matter, good, or is it just written such that the insurance company may have a loophole that says, oh, we don't have to cover that because it's this, it's an employee malfeasance. Yeah, of course.
Yes, and I have seen that. Generally my view of insurance is pretty positive. So cyber insurance, I think you're right. The cost has come down. It's really not that expensive to get, a couple million, $2-5 million worth of coverage with not that high of a retention. And you can kind of adjust your premium if you're willing to take on a little bit of a higher retention. But, generally, I work with cyber insurers all the time when we're helping clients respond to incidents, and generally they're pretty helpful. They will suggest resources. We haven't had huge fights with them about a lot of at least the basic costs of responding to an incident. So I'm generally in favor of cyber insurance. There are definitely some interesting carve outs. One of them is that cyber insurance typically they won't cover an act of war.
Right.
And I always have clients who say, oh, we have this cyber attack. It must be due to Iran, or it must be, there must be some global reason for why we would be attacked. And I say, well, you may be right, may be wrong, but let's not say that in our documents, because we don't want the exclusion for war to deprive you of your insurance.
I guess that's a really good point. So you and Jessica probably, and we certainly recommend if you have a potential breach, maybe put attorney-client privilege on that document that's going out, because if somebody in the initial days of that breach points out, oh, this is really terrible, all our client data is gone, and then it turns out that it's not as bad, hopefully, as they think, you want to make sure that's covered so that a regulator, as Jessica pointed out, doesn't come back later and say, hey, you guys didn't do enough. Here's your own employee saying it was terrible, and included, Jessica, or you conclude later that's not as bad as you thought. So I think that's a really a good point. We have some information on responding to a breach, and we've Ezra and Jessica and Matt have covered this some already. So that's at 17 and 18. So containing the access, investigating and documenting, note that page 18, notifying within 30 days, obviously reporting obligations. Jessica or Ezra or Matt, anything you wanted to add that we haven't covered, or any additional points you want to call out as practical steps for the folks that are listening?
I feel like this has been a really robust discussion already.
Okay, good. Ezra, anything else you want to call out there?
Yeah, no, I guess the thing I come back to is the rules give you the time to do the investigation. So take that time and make sure you try to understand what happened. You may have a great team internally, or you may have a managed service provider who's perfectly capable of investigating, and that's fine. You may want to bring in a third party, and there's great firms that can do a very thorough forensic investigation. They do it day in, day out, and you can scale them on cost. So for maybe a smaller instance, smaller firm, you can use a smaller forensic investigator who may be great. For a major incident, you may want to get, the CrowdStrikes or the Manius of the world, and outside counsel can help you make that decision. We're always recommending that if you're going to go that direction, hire a third party. You want to have the law firm retain them under privilege, so that entire investigation is directed by counsel, subject to attorney-client privilege. So at least you have some control over it when regulators, plaintiffs' lawyers, others come knocking and ask to see the results of that investigation.
And Ezra, I would imagine, and maybe you experience this, you have to do a big bang. Could you say to the firm, hey, look at this, and give me your initial scope review? What are you seeing there?
Absolutely, and I think you really can scope it appropriately. I'll get calls from clients who say, "Oh, we have a compromised email. Somebody clicked on the phishing." You're not going to boil the ocean for something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You may say, "Look, let's just get a firm outside to just check your email, make sure you're all buttoned up."
Mm-hmm.
Very quick. You're not going to spend, tens of thousands of dollars on that. On the flip side, you get the ransom demand, you get the encryption of your system. Well, that's going to be more significant,
Right.
and you want a really heavy hitting, firm to come in, help make sure you're contained, the incident's contained, and then help do a really proper investigation.
And Matt, I think your firm does some of those analyses, so you could kind of think about, hey, look at it, as Ezra said, determine how deep or bad the event is, and then dig further, as Ezra noted, if needed. Responding to breach at 19, I think we covered some of these phishing attacks, ransomware, as Ezra referred to, lost devices. Matt, maybe just talk a little bit about that and some of the technologies that helps now in terms of being able to shut it off quickly and the things you can do.
Yeah, sure. So, with traveling, employees traveling, remote employees, they tend to go out in public, go on airplanes, and, sometimes accidents happen. You might be sitting at the bench at the airport, your flight is called, you run away, and you leave your laptop there. And what's very important is you want to make sure you have, first, a good password. But also, you want to make sure your hard drive is encrypted. So someone, they don't know your password, but we'll take the hard drive out. If it's encrypted, you're safe.
Good point. Excellent. Next, to 20, and I'm going to ask Jessica to comment a little bit on that. The Reg S-P sweeps exams that we've seen a number of the Vigilant. The examiners are focused on, to our mind, whether firms have taken meaningful steps to address their amended requirements. Jessica, can you talk a little bit about your experience about what the SEC is looking for, what the SEC is looking at, and how to provide, probably more importantly, as a practical matter, as we think on the front end, how CCOs or directors, et cetera, or CEOs should be thinking about the evidence that they have to provide to the SEC to show that they took the rule reasonably and seriously, and how to act accordingly.
I think the most important document that the SEC is looking at is the incident response plan. And again, this is the one that is can be very new to CCOs of investment advisors and investment companies. And this is where you need to kind of, like I said, get with the people who kind of know where the information is. But this is, the SEC was very, very focused on this in the adopting release, and it's sort of like the first thing that they turn to. Something else that the SEC is going to want to see are evidence of oversight of service providers. And as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to have documentation of interactions with service providers and also what service providers have. So for example, if the service provider themselves have written cybersecurity policies and procedures, you're going to want to have a copy of that, have it in your records. You're going to want to have any contracts or agreements, whether that be formal or, email back and forth saying what it is that the service provider has agreed to, that they're going to do the 72-hour notice. And I think those are the first top of mind for sweep exams. I think are the most two important, but of course, everything's important too. You're going to want to drill down under that too.
And I think, it's really, as you're running, your CCO and you want to encourage people or get their buy-in and say, oh, I got to come to this meeting, but it's really, really part of good governance and good, business planning as a business. If your data is stolen, your investment advisor, you're going to lose those clients. I mean, even if you have this, you may. And if they, unfortunately, we've seen enough breaches, so maybe they get a letter and they say, well, some data's been stolen. But if you're getting that letter from your investment advisor, Jessica, that's probably really upsetting to the client. So I think it's a good point that it is good. This rule is really sort of accentuating some good business practices as a practical matter that allow people to focus on it and get the right help. Turning to page 21, Jessica, I think we talked about some of these already. Written information and Matt and Ezra as well. Written information security program, system inventory, which I think Ezra hit on. Matt, vendor oversight, access controls and passwords, and the incident response plan. Anything, Jessica, additional that you want to call out or focus on or have practical tips on for the folks that we haven't already covered?
Actually, one of the questions that I got from a lot of smaller investment advisors was kind of a simple one. Can my incident response plan be part of a cybersecurity plan that I have already? And the answer is absolutely yes. And that is exactly what the SEC was thinking of. And it kind of goes back to how they were going to have a cybersecurity rule. So I think don't look to reinvent the wheel if you already have the wheel.
Good. Let's turn next to 22. We had some questions that came through. Thank you for the questions on Reg S-P, further Reg S-P sweep exams, and we have conduct a mock examination, which Jessica, you mentioned already. Ezra, you pre-exam readiness review, testing the policies and procedures, ensure records are organized, briefing personnel, treat the exam preparation as an ongoing process. Ezra, any additional points or maybe anecdotal evidence that you've collected by doing so many of these after the fact that our webinar listeners might want to focus on?
The one thing I guess I would say here is if you have an incident, it's not necessarily the case that it's the worst thing, you have to cover it up. I think it's much better to show, yeah, we had an attack or we had an incident, something was lost, and here's how we addressed it. Our process worked, right? That's what you want to be able to show. And I'll say, a lot of times, so one of the things I do in my practice, we actually do a lot of due diligence when our clients are looking to acquire other firms, maybe other investment advisors. And when I see a data breach at a potential target, I'm not necessarily, in fact, I've never seen a deal not go through because there was a data breach in the past. The question is, well, how did they react to it? And if I can see that they responded appropriately, they did a good investigation, they remediated the issue, they provide appropriate notice, that's actually a good thing in my book because it shows that the firm has the policies and procedures in place when the bad thing, when the incident does happen. We say in our practice now, it's not if, it's not when, it's how often. Because this is just the world we're living in, unfortunately, is that these cyber attacks, these incidents are going to happen. So I guess I would just say, when you think about exam and you have had some issues, think about, how are we going to show that they were addressed appropriately kind of get out front of it and show how the incident actually shows that the organization has the right policies and procedures and governance in place.
Yeah, I think that's all good point. And then Matt, I know your team and your firm is focusing on, how to avoid the attacks and you're monitoring different attacks as they occur and then warning the staff members that say your clients and saying, oh, this is something that's happening now. Watch out for this.
Yeah, we will review the trends. What are the new things that fraudsters are attacking? So once we see things come out in the news, we'll look into it, we'll investigate, and we'll let our clients know.
Great, thank you. We have just a few minutes left. I think I echo Jessica's comment. I think it's been a really robust panel, and I hope everyone finds it interesting. If you're interested in getting some swag or getting that sent to you, you could email and somebody on the team will send out some swag, send the best address. As I said, for the questions, if you have additional questions, obviously could get to all of them today, but please send them. And if you want to address them to Jessica or somebody direct on the panel, Matt or Ezra, we could get that to them. Jessica, any closing remarks?
I guess just don't dawdle. If you're a small advisor, June 3rd is coming up real quick, so make sure that you've got everything in place.
Great. Ezra, any closing comments beyond scared of the jeepers?
Well, I mean, the one thing that maybe we didn't quite cover is, I think, there's a risk-based approach that you can take to think about this. I mean, not all of your vendors, not all of your data is actually that interesting. You probably have a few vendors, you probably have a few systems that actually have consumer information that have NPI. And so, if you're trying to triage, you're saying, look, these dates are coming up, at least focus on the high risk areas. We always talk about in cybersecurity, we talk about crown jewels. Well, what are your crown jewels?
Great point.
And make that the priority, and then you can go from there. I think.
Yeah,
is what I would say.
that's a great point in itself. But as a follow on, you can utilize. If you're an advisor and using Schwab and Fidelity, they have a lot of smart people and they have a lot of good tools. And if you use their tools, in terms of you want to transfer money, you have to have a standing letter of authorization, or or you just have to do certain things. So they thought through for you some key things that you should be thinking about. So I would say, if you're an advisor, certainly take those into account and think about those. And for Vigilant, we're an approved Fidelity and Schwab provider, and they came in and looked at all our systems and looked how we process things. So I think they're, I'm not saying you have to necessarily use a big firm, but I'm saying lots of advisors are using their system. So as a point, utilize smart folks thinking about that. And I think it could be very helpful. Matt, anything else for closing?
Yeah, just a couple of quick items. I do recommend all organizations utilize a password manager system where you can securely keep your login credentials safe instead of saving it on a Word doc, Excel doc on your computer.
Nobody does that.
Yeah.
Sticky note.
Yes. And some of these password managers also will let you know, hey, your Microsoft or your Google account was involved in a breach. Here it is. We recommend you update your login credentials.
Great.
And also, quick item regarding the incident response plan. I think it's a good idea to actually have it printed out or have an offline version, because if your systems ever went
Great
down
point. Yeah.
and you won't be able to access it, at least you have a paper copy on standby.
Well, thank you, Matt. Matt is CEO of Silver Pillar Cyber Advisors. Thank you. Jessica, thank you. Partner Stradley Ronan. Great insights and just good information. And Ezra, thank you so much from Morgan Lewis. We do have all the contact information at the end. And also I want to, this is Salvatore Fay from Vigilant. I want to thank our team who worked a lot, put this slide together, and really wanted to bring you some key information. And again, that's available for download on site. But thank you very much and have a great day, everybody.